The summer of 2007 settled quietly over a small village in Muzaffarpur, Bihar, where life moved at its familiar, unhurried pace. Families knew each other by name, children played freely in dusty yards, and afternoons were filled with the comforting sounds of everyday life. It was in this ordinary setting that a young mother, Chunchan Devi, spent a peaceful afternoon with her 6-month-old daughter, Khushbu, beneath the shade of a tree near the village primary school. The little girl laughed as her mother played with her, unaware that this ordinary day would soon become one of the darkest chapters the village had ever witnessed. Nothing about the moment hinted that a tragedy was quietly waiting just around the corner. The peaceful silence, the warm breeze, and the innocence of a mother's love made the contrast with what was about to happen even more heartbreaking. When Chunchan suddenly remembered an urgent errand nearby, she believed she would only be gone for a few minutes. Trusting the safety of the familiar surroundings, she gently laid Khushbu beneath the tree before hurrying away. But when she returned, the place where her daughter had been sleeping was empty. At first, confusion overwhelmed her. She searched desperately around the school grounds, calling her baby's name, hoping someone had simply picked her up for safety. Villagers joined the search as panic spread through the community. Yet every passing minute deepened the fear that something was terribly wrong. Eventually, with hope slipping away, Chunchan rushed to the local police station, unaware that the investigation she had just begun would uncover a case so disturbing that it would eventually capture attention far beyond the borders of India. Police officers immediately organized a search around the school and questioned everyone who might have seen the missing child. The village buzzed with anxiety as rumors spread from house to house, but no one could provide the answer everyone desperately needed. Then, an unexpected visitor arrived at the police station. A man from a local family claimed he knew someone who could reveal where Khushbu had gone. Instead of pointing toward an experienced criminal or a suspicious stranger, he directed the officers toward an 8-year-old boy playing innocently in the school playground. His name was Amar. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about him. He appeared to be just another child enjoying an afternoon outdoors, far too young to become the center of a murder investigation. Yet something about his expression unsettled those around him. Inside the police station, Amarjeet behaved in a way that puzzled every officer in the room. While adults around him were filled with fear and urgency, he smiled continuously, almost as if he didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. When questioned about Khushbu, he refused to answer immediately. Instead, he laughed and calmly asked the officers for biscuits before he would speak. His unusual behavior transformed the atmosphere inside the station. What had begun as a desperate search for a missing child slowly evolved into something far more disturbing. The officers sensed they were no longer dealing with an ordinary missing person case. They were confronting a mystery that challenged everything they believed about innocence, childhood, and the limits of human behavior. After receiving the biscuits he had requested, Amarjeet finally began to explain what had happened. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the horror of the story he described. According to his account, he had noticed Khushbu sleeping alone beneath the tree near the school. Instead of seeking help or returning her safely to her mother, he carried the infant away to an isolated area hidden from public view. His words were delivered without visible fear or remorse, leaving investigators struggling to understand how such a young child could recount events with such emotional detachment. Every sentence raised even more questions than answers, forcing officers to consider a possibility that seemed almost impossible to believe. Guided by Amarjeet, police eventually reached a secluded location near the school where they discovered Khushbu's lifeless body. The heartbreaking discovery shattered every remaining hope her family had held on to. Chunchan Devi collapsed in grief as the reality became impossible to deny. The entire village stood in disbelief, unable to comprehend how an innocent infant had become the victim of such a senseless act. Even more disturbing to investigators was Amarjeet's reaction throughout the ordeal. While everyone around him mourned, he displayed almost no visible emotion, leaving experienced officers deeply unsettled. It was at that moment that investigators realized this case was far more complex than anyone had imagined, and Amarjeet himself had become the center of an investigation unlike any they had ever handled. As investigators questioned Amarjeet's family, another shocking truth slowly emerged. The people closest to him did not appear completely surprised by the allegations. Reluctantly, they revealed incidents from the past that they had never reported to authorities. Nearly a year earlier, a relative had temporarily left her infant son in the family's care while she settled into a new job. One afternoon, when the adults were away for a short time, Tragedy struck. According to the family's own account, Amarjeet later admitted responsibility for the child's death. Rather than contacting police, the family convinced themselves it had been a terrible accident and chose to keep the incident hidden from the outside world. They hoped silence would protect both their family and their son from an unimaginable future. That decision would haunt them forever. Believing the incident would never happen again, they buried the truth instead of confronting it. The weight of guilt remained hidden within the household while life outside continued as normal. Yet unresolved warning signs often grow more dangerous when ignored. What the family believed was an isolated tragedy would soon prove to be the beginning of an even darker pattern. Investigators now realized they were not looking at a single heartbreaking event but at a history that had remained concealed until another innocent life had been lost. The investigation shifted from solving one crime to uncovering a chain of devastating events that had remained hidden for far too long. Only months after the first hidden tragedy, another devastating incident unfolded inside Amarjeet's own home. According to the family's account, while his parents rested one afternoon, his infant sister was left sleeping nearby. By the time her cries alerted the adults, it was too late to save her. Once again, the family faced an unimaginable loss. Overwhelmed by grief, they confronted Amarjeet, who reportedly promised never to repeat such behavior. Desperate to believe their son could still change, they chose silence once more instead of informing authorities. Their hope that the nightmare had ended would ultimately prove to be a decision with irreversible consequences. With Khushbu's death now under investigation and the family's hidden history finally exposed, police began to understand they were dealing with a child whose behavior demanded urgent psychological evaluation. Specialists conducted extensive assessments to better understand his mental state. The findings described in the source suggested profound behavioral abnormalities that challenged investigators and mental health professionals alike. For the people of the village, however, no diagnosis could erase the pain left behind. Families who had once allowed their children to play freely now looked at their surroundings with fear. Parents held their children closer than ever before, realizing that sometimes the greatest danger can emerge from the place where it is least expected. The investigation was only beginning, but its revelations would soon attract worldwide attention. The psychological evaluations that followed revealed a deeply troubling picture. According to the findings described in the case, specialists concluded that Amarjeet displayed severe behavioral abnormalities and appeared unusually detached from the suffering of others. Investigators were struck not only by the crimes themselves but also by his complete absence of visible remorse during questioning. While most children his age would be frightened inside a police station, Amarjeet reportedly remained calm, smiled frequently, and seemed unable to grasp the emotional weight of the tragedy surrounding him. For experienced officers who had investigated countless violent crimes, this was unlike anything they had encountered before. The case challenged long-held assumptions about childhood, criminal responsibility, and the complexities of the developing human mind. News of the investigation quickly spread beyond the small village where it had begun. Journalists, psychologists, and legal experts all struggled to answer the same haunting question. How could someone so young become involved in such horrific crimes? The case sparked difficult conversations throughout India about mental health, early intervention, and the responsibility of families to report disturbing behavior before it escalates. For the villagers, however, these debates offered little comfort. They had watched their peaceful community transform into the center of one of the country's most shocking criminal investigations. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely now lived with constant fear, knowing that the illusion of absolute safety had been shattered forever. Because Amarjeet was only 8 years old, India's juvenile justice system treated the case differently from how it would have handled an adult offender. Rather than being sent to an adult prison, the court ordered that he be placed in a juvenile rehabilitation facility, where he would receive psychological treatment and therapy. The decision immediately divided public opinion. Some believed that, regardless of his age, the gravity of the crimes demanded harsher punishment. Others argued that a child with profound psychological problems required treatment rather than lifelong imprisonment. It became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case, raising questions that had no easy answers for the victims' families. However, legal arguments could never erase their unimaginable loss. Every birthday, every festival, and every family gathering became a painful reminder of the children who would never return home. Chunchan Devi's life had changed forever in a matter of minutes. and the grief carried by the other affected families remained equally profound. While the justice system focused on rehabilitation, the emotional scars left behind could not be measured in court rulings or legal procedures. The people closest to the victims would continue carrying those memories. Long after headlines faded from public attention, years passed, and Amarjeet remained inside the juvenile system receiving treatment. Outside the institution, life slowly returned to normal for the village. But normal would never mean the same thing again. The case had permanently altered how parents viewed safety and trust. Children were no longer left unattended as casually as before. And stories about the case continued to circulate from one generation to the next. What had once been a quiet rural community became remembered across the country for a tragedy no one wished to relive. The events served as a painful reminder that warning signs, no matter how uncomfortable, should never be ignored. In 2016, after reaching adulthood, Amarjeet's period in juvenile custody came to an end. According to the source, he was released after completing the sentence allowed under juvenile law and was believed to be living under a different identity. His whereabouts were not publicly known. That fact alone fueled countless discussions and media reports, with many people expressing concern, while others pointed out that the juvenile justice system was designed around rehabilitation rather than permanent punishment. Whether one agreed with the outcome or not, the legal process had reached its conclusion, even though public debate continued for years afterward, as documentaries, articles, and television programs revisited the investigation. The story gradually gained international attention. The extraordinary age of the accused became one of the reasons the case was discussed so widely across the world. Yet behind every headline was a much more important reality. Several families had suffered unimaginable losses that could never be reduced to statistics or sensational headlines. True crime often focuses on the offender, but the deepest impact is always carried by those left behind: the parents, relatives, and communities forced to rebuild lives forever, divided into a before and an after. The case also became a powerful lesson for psychologists, law enforcement agencies, and families alike. Experts frequently emphasize that persistent patterns of violent or deeply disturbing behavior in children require immediate professional attention. While the reasons behind such behavior can be extraordinarily complex, early intervention may help prevent future harm. Looking back, many observers wondered whether different decisions during the earliest warning signs could have changed the course of events. The transcript itself does not answer that question, but it leaves behind a difficult reflection about the importance of recognizing serious behavioral problems before they become irreversible. Nearly 2 decades later, the story of Amarjeet continues to be remembered as one of the most disturbing criminal cases involving a juvenile offender described in the source. It is not remembered because of violence alone, but because it challenged everything people believed about childhood innocence, family responsibility, and the limits of the justice system. Every investigation leaves behind evidence, reports, and legal records, but some cases leave something far deeper. They force society to confront questions that have no simple answers. This is one of those cases where the search for understanding remains just as difficult as the search for justice. That as this story comes to an end, the victims deserve to remain at its heart. Their lives, though tragically brief, should never be overshadowed by the notoriety of the offender. Behind every true crime story are real families whose grief continues long after cameras stop recording and headlines disappear. Cases like this remind us that justice is not measured only by court decisions but also by the lessons society chooses to learn. Sometimes the most haunting stories are not remembered because they provide answers, but because they leave us asking how such a tragedy could ever have happened, and how future tragedies might one day be prevented.